Um, okay, all right, so today we're going to talk about the marine adaptations lab. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and go right here. So this is just sort of a reminder of where we're at. This is the second to last lab. Next week we won't have lab because it's Easter. So there's nothing due, no lab, no quiz, nothing like that. And then the week after that, we'll be having these regular Zoom drop-ins, and we'll be talking about climate change and El Nino. And then right now, week 12 is sort of a free week before the lab final. I'm going to set up this lab, the paleobathymetry lab, in case you have missed any lab or need extra credit. But also, it's a really good cumulative lab. It sort of takes everything that we've learned this semester and puts it into one lab. So if you can do that with little to no problem, then you're really set up for the lab final. So I encourage everybody to do this lab just to test where they are as far as like understanding, cumulative understanding, of learning, of putting things that we learned in bathymetry and plate tectonics and all that good stuff together to complete this final sort of test. But again, it's not mandatory. It is an optional lab. So if you don't want to do it, that's totally fine. But if you do it, then it's it's either extra credit or it makes up for a lab that you've missed. Alrighty, so let's talk about benthic organisms. So for this lab, we're going to take what we learned about waves, materials of the seafloor, marine adaptations, and put it all together to learn about benthic organisms, environments, and just different fossils of the continental shelf. So instead of like talking about the whole ocean, we're just talking about the continental shelf. So that part right off of the shore before it slopes down. So the purpose of this lab is to identify and compare shells of modern benthic organisms, understand how wave energy and the hard and soft substrates of the seafloor. So substrate is just like, what is the seafloor made of? So how the hard and soft substrate relates and varies across the seafloor, specifically the continental slope. And then to just appreciate the different feeding behaviors and different ways that benthic organisms move across that substrate. So depending on the wave energy, depending on what the seafloor is made of, depending on what's available to them, they're going to feed differently and they're going to move differently. And so how we're going to do that is to learn to identify different benthic organisms that are alive today, and examine the relationships between benthic organisms and the environmental conditions for which they're adapted. Because if we can understand this, if we can understand that relationship, then we can use that to look at fossils, and to look at fossils and determine the paleo environment, or what used to be there. So benthic organisms live on the bottom of the seafloor, and depending on their ability to cope with subaerial exposure and loss of water, so like, can they live totally out of water? Can they live with it being underwater sometimes and above water in other times, or do they need to always live under the water? Depending on wave energy and turbulence, so can they deal with a lot of turbulence or a lot of wave energy, or do they need something that's calm? And then the composition of the seafloor is also a big factor. If it's rocky, gravelly versus mud, can they move around in the rocky and gravelly substrate, or do they need mud to be able to move easier, or do they need that rock and that gravel to hold on to as a sort of permanent home? And then also the food web dynamics. What's around them, what can they eat, and then in turn, what can eat them? So because all four of these factors vary a lot, there's a vertical zonation of benthic organisms. And it's subdivided, I'm going to draw it out, in 3 different zones. So here's your 3 zones. My horrible Zoom annotate drawing. 1, 2, 3. So remember last lab, we talked about littoral meaning near shore. So in this situation, supralittoral means it's above the high tide. So if I go ahead and draw out a little schematic, let's say that this is my little continental shelf area. And let's say that this is my high tide maximum. Oh. And down here will be my low tide minimum. And what I mean by that is the high tide maximum is the highest amount that the, oh, whoops, that was horrible. The highest amount that the water, the highest height that the water reaches, and my low tide minimum is the lowest height that the water reaches. And so these are my maximum and my minimum water depth, let's say. The supralittoral region is going to be above high tide. So basically, unless it is a storm event, it's never going to be below water. So our benthic organisms that live up here, live above the high tide maximum, are not able to live underwater full time or with subaerial exposure. So sometimes underwater, sometimes above water. Our mid-littoral organisms are going to live between the high tide maximum and the low tide minimum. So that means that they are adapted to live in an area that is sometimes underwater and sometimes below water, or sorry, sometimes underwater and sometimes above water. And then our lower littoral organisms live below the low tide minimum and onto the continental shelf. So that means that they live underwater all the time. So they are not adapted to live at any point above water in an aerial environment. And so these two zones, the mid-littoral and the lower littoral, are called the sublittoral zones. So let's try, I wish there was a, oh, here we go. So the mid-littoral to lower littoral is called the sublittoral zones. So if you think about it, the prefix, right, is sub, so below water, right? Supralittoral is above water, above the tide. In all three of these zones, or in the supralittoral and sublittoral zones, all four of these aspects are going to change, right? In my lower littoral zones, my wave energy and my turbulence is going to be lower. In my mid-littoral zones, there's going to be a lot of wave action, a lot of turbulence, right? That mud in the water, that the cloudiness. In my mid-littoral zones, they're also going to have to be able to cope with sometimes being above water, sometimes being below water. Here in my lower littoral zones and my mid-littoral zones, they're going to have to deal with the different composition of seafloor substrate. And then, of course, that food web dynamic. So if we keep going, and let me clear that annotation. So speaking, actually, wait, can I use, I'm going to keep this down here, even though I think I'm going to risk it being super annoying. But I want to show this graphic really quick while I talk about the sublittoral zones. So remember, these down here are my sublittoral zones, the mid-littoral and the lower littoral. And the energy of those zones is going to affect the type of bottom sediment that settles there. So coarser sediment, you learn this in the materials of the seafloor lab. Coarser sediment is concentrated in a high energy environment. So especially in this mid-littoral zone where there's constant wave action, it's never calm, right? That's gonna be an environment where there's coarser sediment, coarser sands, and gravel. And then in the lower littoral zones, we're going to start to get into calm conditions below the wave action. And so finer sediment is going to be able to settle out of the water column. So here in the mid-littoral zone, we've got more wave action, more turbulence, right? More stuff in the water. And in the lower littoral zones, we're going to have more calm conditions, so that stuff that was in the water moving about in the mid-littoral zones is going to be able to finally settle out. And this, therefore, there's going to be a lower, a finer sediment in the bottom. So this variation is really important because it regulates benthic life and the distribution of benthic organisms on the seafloor. So we're going to find different benthic organisms here versus here in the lower littoral. So we touched on this a little bit, but the two major benthic communities can be defined based on the type of substrate they live on. So there's hard bottom communities. This is the first one, and there's soft bottom communities, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Hard bottom communities are associated with rocky shorelines and coarser sand deposits. So we already know what that means as in terms of energy. We know that means a high energy environment. And then soft bottom communities are composed of medium and finer grained sand and mud. So that's going to be a low energy environment. Forgot how to spell environment for 2 seconds. So let's put this down here so it makes a little bit more sense. So again, our hard bottom communities, rocky shorelines, coarse sand deposits is a high energy environment. And then our soft bottom is more of a low energy environment. So again, all of these things work together to form the specific environment that these benthic organisms live on. 80% of benthic organisms are epifaunal, and that just means that they live attached to substrate or on substrate. So epi is on, right? So on fauna, epifaunal is attached to the substrate. And 20% are enfaunal, which means they live in the sediment. So they bury themselves down. So enfaunal, enfauna, and sediment. Okay, so the different environments are going to promote different feeding habits, right? So just like humans, just like all animals, whatever is closest to us is what we're going to eat, right? Is what we're going to grow up eating. So especially before superstores and Walmart and all that good stuff, we only ate things that were either in season or around us. So because there are different substrate, there's different wave energy, there's different turbulence, that's going to promote a lot of different feeding habits depending on where the specific organisms live. So the feeding habits are super diverse. Some are filter feeders, which means that they sort of attach onto the substrate and they allow water to pass through them and they filter out their food from the water. There are detritus feeders, which means that they eat things that are in the that are on the substrate. So whatever is in the mud or falling down out of the water column, detritus feeders are going to eat. There are herbivores, they eat plants, right? So kelp, seaweed, all that good stuff. Scavengers, which is going to eat dead material, and predators, which are organisms that actually hunt, right? So just think about like the type of things that these different feeding habits need in order to be successful. So filter feeders, for example, really need a rocky bottom, right? Because without a rocky bottom or a hard bottom, let me change this to hard bottom. Without a hard bottom, there's nothing for a filter feeder to attach onto, and therefore they're not going to be able to stay in one place, right? With any wave action, with any turbulence, they'd fall over. And you might think, well, why don't they just live somewhere without wave action, without turbulence? But if they lived in a place without turbulence, there wouldn't be anything in the water column for them to filter out and feed, right? Everything would have settled out. So they need a hard bottom to attach onto, and they need turbulence because that's their food. Detritus feeders are going to need a, let's say a mud, let's say more finer grained bottom, so a soft bottom. because they dig into the substrate and eat material out, like off of the substrate, or they eat material that's falling out of the water column. So they need calmer conditions, or a calmer environment. So maybe some wave action, but nothing too turbulent, nothing too aggressive, for lack of a better word. They're going to live in an area where finer things can fall out of the water column. Herbivores, I'm going to move this over just a tiny bit. Herbivores are going to need to live in a place where kelp is, right? Where kelp can grow. So that's going to be where sunlight can still penetrate the water, where kelp can grow, places that maybe have some light wave action. Or I'll just put wave action in general because those. And then scavengers, they eat dead things, right? So they can pretty much, depending on how they scavenge, live wherever, but they're probably going to live in an area of coarser grained silt to sand. And they'll probably live in the sublittoral zones, mostly the mid-littoral, where there's a mix between subaerial and underwater conditions. And then predators, of course, are going to eat things that are swimming around, so they don't really need to worry about the substrate unless they crawl along the substrate, and in that case are going to need, again, coarse-grained to silt sand material. So when you are doing this lab, think about what marine adaptations they have and how those best suit either their feeding habits, where they live, and stuff like that. And then you also need to think, okay, if my benthic organism is living in a soft bottom environment, what does that mean as far as their feeding habits? Can they be a filter feeder? Can they be a detritus feeder? Can they be a predator? And why? So it's really taking what you've learned from other labs and putting it together in this one. And I believe that's it. So just really quickly, I want to go to the lab and show you some things. So this is a more in-depth figure than what I drew on the PowerPoint, right? We've got the lower littoral, mid-littoral, and supralittoral. Remember that these two are sublittoral zones. And then this is how they, how different types of energy might be found in these zones. And then here is where you're going to look up at, see different shells, different fossils, and identify them. Sorry, I don't know why I'm having such a hard time thinking about words right now. But you're gonna see a different shell, see a different fossil, and you're gonna have to identify them. And you're gonna use this chart. So instead of just clicking on it directly, you can do two things. You can, one, come over here and open it, or here, click on it from here, but I would right click it and open it in a new link or tab. Because that way, if you just click on it straight from here, it's gonna take you out of the website. And the best thing to do is to have this in another tab so you can click back and forth. If you've got a computer that promotes this, you can also just click, snap them next to each other so that you can be looking at this benthic organisms chart while also answering these questions. Okay, it's a relatively short lab, so I really encourage you to read through at least to here first before answering any questions. And then, as always, office hours are Tuesday and Wednesday, 12 to 1:30. And if that doesn't work out for you, you can just let me know. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to email.
Thank you.
No worries. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.